Hi, I'm Scott. I'm the executive pastor at The Crossing, and welcome back to another week of our Follow series, where we are looking at the life of Jesus as told to us in the book of Mark. And for the last several chapters, the disciples have been wearing their Salt Life shirts as their ministry has taken them around the Sea of Galilee and on boats over the Sea of Galilee. Everything is focused on this lake that is in the northern part of Israel. And in particular, a little over a month ago, in fact, I read to you the miracle of Jesus calming the storm, and we talked through the implications of that in Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41, if at some point you want to flip back there and read through it again. But Jesus and his disciples were on a boat. And in fact, Jesus was napping because he had had a busy day in the sun and healing people and teaching, and he was sleeping soundly. But the disciples were having a decidedly different experience as they were completely losing their minds due to a storm that had rushed in and was threatening to flood their boat. And the point of that, and the reason I bring it up, is at the end of it, Jesus confronts the disciples about their fear instead of having faith. And it highlights the two fundamental responses that we have to Jesus: fear or faith. And so at the end of that story where Jesus calms the storm, we get an indication of the state of the heart of the disciples. It was still kind of cluttered with weeds and rocks, and they were having trouble discerning just who Jesus was. In fact, the disciples ask at the end of that, "Who is this man?" So today we once again find ourselves living the salt life with the disciples, and we're going to be in Mark chapter 6 at the very end, and we're going to start with verse 45. I'm going to read 45 and 46, so if you have a Bible handy, or if you like to read it on your phone, or if you're just going to follow along on the screen, just make sure that you are internalizing the Word of God and bringing it in so that it is hidden in your heart. So here we go, Mark chapter 6. It says, "Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and head across the lake to Bethsaida, while he sent the people home. After telling everyone goodbye, he went up into the hills by himself to pray." So at this point in the story, the disciples must be on an emotional high plane. They had just returned at the beginning of chapter 6 from being sent out by Jesus, and they came back to report all the people that they had healed and all the evil spirits that they had cast out. On the heels of that, because of the crowds that were following Jesus around, Jesus fed a crowd of thousands of people, and Kendall led us through that particular passage last week. Jesus started with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he fed anywhere from 5 to 15,000 people, depending on how you're doing your counting. And we can just imagine how amped up these guys were, how much energy they had, how excited they were for the future, and change was happening and everything was going on. But then we're told immediately, right? Mark is not one to waste any time. Immediately, what's going on next happens as a response to this feeding miracle. And what Jesus does is, instead of high-fiving anyone, instead of sending up fireworks for the amazing display of power, he insists that his 12 closest disciples get in a boat. He made them. That's what insisting means. And this also implies that the disciples were resistant to wanting to get in and leave the crowds and go away from everything that was happening. They probably did want to celebrate. They probably wanted to talk and break down what they had just witnessed in these basketfuls of bread that they were carrying around. But Jesus throws cold water on their party plans. You must leave. And to top off their disappointment, Jesus was making them leave without him. Jesus was going to hang behind. Now, Mark doesn't tell us why Jesus is sending the disciples away. Mark has a very intentional focus related to following Jesus that we're going to get to. But in the Gospel of John, he adds a very interesting detail about what's going on, what's bubbling through the crowd at this point, which is probably motivating Jesus' response. And here's what we read in John chapter 6. This is verse 15. It says, "When Jesus saw that they were ready to force him to be their king, he slipped away into the hills by himself." This gives us a clear picture and a clear reason why Jesus was motivated and his sense of urgency to get the disciples away. We've already seen through the first 6 chapters of Mark that the disciples are really struggling to understand who Jesus is and what it means that he is the Messiah. They had to ask the meaning of the parable of the soils a couple chapters ago. Jesus had to chastise them for their fear and their lack of faith and trust in who he is and what they were going to do. And so this situation, all of this, all that's happening around this feeding miracle, this crowd that is now getting rambunctious and amped up and wants to just put Jesus on their shoulders and usher him to Jerusalem right there, this presents a very serious temptation of false desires. It's going to build into what the disciples' expectations, what their expectations for what the Messiah looks like are going to be. The crowd was just happy they had somebody that was going to feed them. The disciples, they were expecting a conquering king to come up and they were going to be part of the king's court. And these desires, these were cluttering up the soil of their heart. And they were presenting an impediment to following Jesus for who he truly is. And so what we see here in Jesus' response in John is that Jesus' command in temptation is separation. Jesus doesn't say, let's hang around and see how your willpower can gut it out. He says, right away, this is urgent, separate yourselves from temptation. Our selfish desires as we follow Jesus often get in the way. And they lead us to look away from God, to take our mind away from the things of heaven and to put them on the things of the earth. And we are all prone to be tempted. In fact, as you are listening to this, I am sure rolling through your mind, you can think of 10 different ways in a typical day that you are tempted to walk away and follow your own desires rather than the desires of Jesus. But in case you need a list, we envy others for what they have and what we don't have. We lust for others, and whether it's in a sexual way or whether it's in some other way. We have a lack of contentment for what God has provided us, and we want more. We struggle with insecurity or a need for approval. Or we want to try to be perfect in our own strength. Or we live for accomplishment or greed. And that's just a partial list. We could go on and on until the cows come home, listing out the things that tempt us. But what Jesus instructs is when we are falling into that, when we realize that we're struggling with some temptation, that we need to create some space. We're not just to stay and to let it beat against us. If we are weak, which we are very weak, and some thought and some desire, some relationship is going to cause you to be out of step with Jesus, then you have to get in the boat and you have to go away. Here's what Paul writes to the Corinthian church about this same sort of situation. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. Paul writes, "The temptations in your life are no different from what others experience." So we all have common temptations that we deal with. And God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than what you can stand. God knows what's inside us. He knows how we're broken. He knows what we're bent to do, and so he will not allow us to be tempted more than we can bear. When you are tempted, he will show you a way out so that you can endure. There will always be a way out. Just like Jesus showed the disciples the way out. To get away from the crowds, he put them in the boat and he threw them away from shore. And so we have to be sensitive to what is the way out from the temptation that Jesus has provided for us. We might resist, right? Because sometimes sin feels good and we're prone to it and it's comfortable and we've done it before and we sometimes don't fight enough to walk back into it. It's not easy. Jesus had to force the disciples in the boat, and we sometimes have to force one step in front of the other as we are following that way out that God has provided for us. So back to Mark. After the disciples are in the boat, they're enjoying a nice cruise to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus cleans up, he puts everything in trash bags, he waves goodbye to everyone and says, "Not today, I'm not going to be king." And he has a response as well. At the end of those 2 verses in Mark chapter 6 that I read, we see that Jesus went by himself to pray. And this shows us another response that we are to have. After we have separated from the temptation, our response to temptation has to be prayer. I mean, Jesus himself, he had to get the focus of his heart recalibrated. He needed to go to the source of truth and the source of his identity, his Father in heaven, and he had to reconnect. He had to reconnect to the purpose that God had given him, lest he forget and be tempted that this would be the way to go and to be king. Maybe that would be easier than God's will for him that he was following. How often do we just move on from temptation? Right? Maybe we have followed the path that God has laid out for us. And then we just forget and move on without doing any sort of examination, without doing any sort of reconnection, not taking any time to reflect or bring out those false desires and lay them at the feet of God. Prayer has to be part of the response of temptation. That is the only way that we will get oriented properly. It's the only way that we will be able to be steadfast as we follow Jesus. And part of the process of learning to follow Jesus that we're seeing, and we're going to see in the disciples as we go through this whole book, is learning new responses. Instead of giving in to temptation and sin, we learn to find the way out that God provides. Instead of ignoring what's going on inside of us, we sit down and we pray and we connect to the source of who we are and the fertile ground of our hearts. In a time of temptation, part of our response has to be prayer. So we're going to continue on now that the disciples are in the boat, back to Mark chapter 6. I'm going to read the next verse and a half, starting with 47. It says, "Late that night, the disciples were in their boat." So they've been on the lake for quite a while now, in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on land. He saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard and struggling against the wind and waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. Now, I want to stop right here before we get to the miracle part of this, because I think something for us to see here is the disciples are exactly in the right place. Right? Jesus has told them to get in the boat. They are in the boat. They are exactly where Jesus wants them to be. And I want us to really fully embrace that. But even though they're where they're supposed to be, they are in serious trouble. Literally, what the Greek says here is they are tormented in rowing. They are tortured by the effort that they are expending to battle against the wind and the waves. And so we ask ourselves this question: how can that be? How can they be exactly where Jesus wants them, doing exactly what Jesus said, yet they are in serious trouble? I mean, isn't the safest place to be in the center of God's will? I mean, if you've been in church for any amount of time, somebody has probably said that to you, but that doesn't appear to be the case with the disciples. And I think if we're all honest as we're reading this, we want the fairy tale, right? We want, when Jesus tells us to do something, we want the happily ever after, and we want things to work out just right so that we have a life of serenity and security and peace, and we don't have to worry about anything. That we get to sit back in our cozy and comfy surroundings. But the reality that we're seeing here is that following Jesus, being obedient to what Jesus calls us to do, might just and probably will lead us into some discomfort and struggle and danger. So a question that we have to wrestle with as we're reading this account of the disciples on the lake is, does Jesus' command here make you uncomfortable? I mean, how does it strike you that Jesus left them until 3 a.m. to struggle on the lake? Right? He had sent them out after dinner, sent the crowd home, so it's probably still daylight, and he doesn't go out to them till 3 o'clock in the morning. Well, I think what's going on here is we have to remember this is kind of a sequel to the previous time on the boat that I started off with at the beginning when I reminded us of Jesus calming the storm. And at the end of that, he had chastised the disciples for their fear rather than their faith. So the reality is, our faith is the only thing of value that we possess. God's priority in our life above everything else is to refine and strengthen and deepen that faith that we have in Jesus. Here's what Peter writes. Peter, who's in this boat right now, being tortured by the waves till 3 o'clock in the morning before Jesus decides to get off his rear end and go out on the lake. Peter writes this in his first letter. He says, "These trials will show that your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold, though your faith is far more precious than mere gold. So when your faith remains strong through many trials, it will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world." Peter wrote this so we can see a big change in Peter and his attitude and his faith later when he writes that letter, verse now when he is on the boat. So if you're sitting there and looking at this story and thinking, well, Jesus is just kind of being cruel, or maybe he's being cold or non-responsive or uncaring to these disciples who've left everything for him. Well, if that's your perspective, then the problem might be that you're undervaluing faith. Purity of faith is the priority in all of our lives. God uses everything to chisel away our trust and our grasping onto other things so that the only thing that we will hope in, the only thing that we will trust in, will be in his Son. Faith should have that singular laser focus on the object, which is Jesus. Faith should be steadfast in all circumstances, whether the waves are pounding against the side of the boat of our lives or whether we are floating along on calm waters. Our faith needs to be sure. So Jesus does go out to them and he's walking on the water. Now this leads us to some questions because of course there's skeptics everywhere and they try to explain away the miraculous and say, well, clearly Jesus was just walking on a sandbar. Or Jesus was just walking on the shore and the disciples were watching him there. Well, these are fishermen. I think they know that they're in the middle of the lake, right? They're experienced at this sort of thing. And I liked what Kendall said last week about miracles when he was referring to the creation of bread from the 5 loaves and 2 fish. We might say, no man can walk on water. Well, that's exactly the point. No man can walk on water. Jesus is God come to live among us. I really like a scene. I know we've got some Star Wars fans out there, so I'm trying to build allegiance with you. There's a scene in The Force Awakens. I don't know whether you like that Star Wars movie. That's immaterial to this. But there's Han Solo is talking to this new girl, Rey, and Rey says, "Is the Force a real thing?" And Han Solo says, he turns to her and says, "It's true. The Force, the Jedi, all of it. It's all true." Well, that's my perspective with the miracles of Jesus, right? Did Jesus multiply the 5 loaves and 2 fish to feed thousands of people? It's all true. Did Jesus actually walk on water to come out to his disciples who were in the middle of the Sea of Galilee? It is all true. Did Jesus go around healing people of their diseases and casting out evil spirits? All of it. It is all true. This is part of the message of the kingdom, that God is making things new. He is righting all of the wrongs, and this is what it looks like. Continuing in Mark chapter 6, starting with the second half of verse 48, we'll go for the next few verses. So he, meaning Jesus, intended to go past them, which is kind of odd. But when they saw him walking on the water, they cried out in terror, thinking he was a ghost. They were all terrified when they saw him, but Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage. I am here." Just want to pause where it says, "I am here," or if you're reading in the New International Version, it says, "It is I." Those are the words, "I am." And those are probably familiar to you, and we're going to look at that in just a second. But Jesus says right there, "I am." Very intentional. Continuing on. Then he climbed into the boat and the wind stopped. They were totally amazed, for they still didn't understand the significance of the miracle of the loaves. Their hearts were too hard to take it in. See, I think as the disciples are struggling on the boat and they're feeling tortured by all they're going through, I think they're being confronted by their disappointment. Rather than getting to celebrate the feeding the people and the day of teaching and the conquests that went on, they're living with these unmet expectations. They're probably hurt that Jesus, they feel like he has cast them aside and they are out there all alone. And this was creating in them hard hearts. So much so that when Jesus is approaching them, the only person that they know that could possibly do this, they don't even recognize him. They can't see what is literally right in front of them like the palm of their hand. Jesus is doing something even more remarkable, though, than just walking on water. The symbolism that Jesus is employing here to teach the disciples about his identity. So if you remember in Mark chapter 4, verse 41, this is when Jesus calmed the storm. The disciples, at the end of that, they say, "Who is this man?" Well, now Jesus is answering this question in full view of them. He is giving them an epiphany. And an epiphany is just a fancy church word for the appearance or manifestation of a divine figure. And so Jesus is showing himself to be God. Now, I went to look up a funny story about an epiphany because I wanted to be more like Kendall and have a cute story at the beginning to draw your attention right in. But the present modern use of the word epiphany is a moment where you have sudden clarity about yourself. And I thought that was really ironic. It really shows us the source of where we think God is. We think that we are God. So now an epiphany refers to something about us rather than something about a divine figure outside of us. That was just a little rabbit trail for free because Kendall does that too, and I want you to feel totally comfortable. So we see in this story, there's several things going on. Jesus is walking on the water. He's going to pass by them. They have a lack of recognition. Jesus uses the phrase, I am, and then when he sees the disciples, he tells them, do not fear. These are all attributes of epiphany stories found throughout the Bible. And I just want to go through real quick and show you some different examples. In Job chapter 9, verse 8, this attributes to God being the one who is going to walk on water. It says, he alone has spread out the heavens and marches on the waves of the seas. And there's other examples that we could go through, but for time, I'm just mentioning one verse. As far as the idea of Jesus passing by, that was common for God because people can't look at him directly. We would be overwhelmed. We would die. So in Exodus chapter 33, when Moses wants to see God, here's what God does. The Lord continued, look, stand near me on this rock as my glorious presence passes by. I will hide you in the crevice of the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. So Jesus is going to pass by, he's going to show them his glory, just like God was doing with Moses. In Exodus chapter 3, this is kind of the most famous occurrence of God using the words, I am, to describe himself. When Moses asked, who should I tell the Israelites has sent me? God replied to Moses, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And then in Isaiah chapter 41, verse 10, this is just one of a number of examples of after the response of the person of God saying, do not fear. So Isaiah 41 says, don't be afraid, for I am with you. Don't be discouraged, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will hold you up with my victorious right hand. All of this is Jesus taking an opportunity to show very clearly his identity to the disciples. Now, in a few chapters, we're going to have an even clearer demonstration of who Jesus is because we see that the disciples still don't quite get it. So Jesus is having to get really more and more and more obvious with them. But he has just shown them his identity as God come in the flesh to walk around them. And then I think he does the most remarkable thing that we're so tempted to just overlook and dismiss in this story. We're told after Jesus passes by and as the disciples are afraid, we're told that Jesus climbs into the boat. This is Jesus being that good shepherd that we talked about last week, when Jesus identified the people as like sheep without a shepherd, and the people who were supposed to be shepherds had kind of done a terrible job and abandoned their position and been selfish. Jesus is demonstrating being the good shepherd. He got into the boat with them during their distress. And I have to be honest with you, this is an area of struggle for me. I'm preaching to myself right now in this very moment, so this next thing that flashes on the screen, this is for me. Following Jesus is not about the absence of suffering, but rather the presence of Jesus in our circumstance. Jesus hops in the boat with us. Whatever you're going through, whatever you have gone through, whatever you will go through in the future, Jesus is hopped in the boat with you. Yeah, the storm was calmed when Jesus got in the boat, but that is incidental. This is not a rescue story. This is a story about the condition of the disciples' hearts as they are following Jesus. They're so focused on their expectations and their circumstance, and they didn't understand the link from the feeding of the 5,000 story to the manna from heaven as part of the Exodus story. So again, Jesus has to progressively get more and more obvious about who he is. Their hearts are hard and they are impervious to God's revelation in their life. And you might wonder, why? Why is Mark writing like this? Why are we seeing this? Why aren't the disciples presented in a more heroic version? Well, as the reader, our dissonance is growing between what we know about Jesus, because we were told very first words of this gospel that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and the disciples' inability to see. That's a tension right there. And that's good for us as the reader because it should inform us in how we follow. There should be a contrast because we do have the fuller vision than the disciples have in this moment. So I think what this does is it invites us to change our prayers from, God, please take this from me, or God, please make this all better, to, Jesus, please get in the boat with me. Now, I'm not saying God doesn't make things better. I'm not saying that he doesn't take things from us. But our first concern, our first realization should be that Jesus is always in the boat with us. So finishing out this story, we're going to finish out Mark chapter 6. Says, after they had crossed the lake, they landed in Gennesaret. They brought the boat to shore and climbed out. The people recognized Jesus at once, and they ran throughout the whole area, carrying sick people on mats to wherever they heard he was. Wherever he went, in villages, cities, or the countryside, they brought the sick out to the marketplaces. They begged him to let the sick touch at least the fringe of his robe, and all who touched him were healed. So this segment that we've been through in the past couple weeks, it started out with crowds being fed, and here we see that it's ending with crowds being healed. And I think the big thing for us today in this paragraph is just contrast the level of recognition. When Jesus was walking on the water, the disciples saw a ghost. They didn't know what was coming at them. The minute Jesus stepped foot on shore, the crowds recognized him and ran to respond to him immediately. Now, we know that the crowds, they just want to be healed. They're not necessarily any more aware of Jesus as the Messiah as the disciples are at this point, but that's not Mark's purpose right here. He's not passing that kind of judgment. They have a fledgling faith, and they are flocking to Jesus because they recognize the power in him. Faith, even if it's just in Jesus' power to heal, is being rewarded. So this is the picture of Jesus being in the boat with the people of this town and this region. And Jesus is revealing the order of the kingdom that is to come on earth as it is in heaven. God is in the process of restoring and setting all things right.